Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review. 7 stories from the American Revolution. The 7 stories I published just this previous week for my website, founderoftheday.com, where, as I said, I publish articles about the American Revolution 7 days a week, and we like to focus on the more obscure, lesser-known American founders. I'm going to move my microphone just a little bit closer to make sure you can hear me better. Thank you so much for coming. We have a lot of fun and quirky characters to discuss this week. I hope you're as excited as I am. I want to give a big shout out. A lot of people, I started using PayPal for donations to help offset some of the costs here, and several people helped me out this week. Karen, Jane, James, and one last name that is eluding me, but I will remember it, I assure you. Thank you guys so much for Katherine. Thank you so much for contributing. Anyhoozle, let's get to the Revolutionary War, shall we? First, we're going to start off with the Independent Examiner. Now, as I've mentioned recently, over the last several months, every Friday I've published an article for an anti-federalist paper. It was Brutus, the Essays of Brutus, but we've completed Brutus, and we have now moved on to the Independent Examiner. Now, the Independent Examiner has very little information out there. In fact, the book I use over here, the Not So Complete Anti-Federalist by Herbert J. Storing, does discuss it a little bit, but long, short story, short, long, we don't know who wrote the Independent Examiner, but we do know that it was written in the in Virginia. It was published in Virginia in the first half of 1788, when we were talking about whether or not to ratify the United States Constitution. And as you might imagine, as an anti-federalist article or series of articles, the Independent Examiner was very much not for independence. Now, I'm sorry, not for the Constitution. They were already for independence. Obviously, in the end, it loses. Now, I did not review the first article yet. I was doing an assessment, kind of a here's what's to come with the Independent Examiner. Interestingly enough, I had gone on to the interweb after I did a research for about an hour. I was looking around through my books here to find what I could find. And I thought I had it, but I wanted to do a quick Google search, and, well, not much came up. One thing came up, actually, an article titled, "The Impartial Examiner Confronts Arbitrary Government." And what do you know? It was written by me and published on Founder of the Day just last summer. Just to give you a little hint at how many articles I actually write, it had totally eluded my mind that I had already written a brief article about a brief overview of the Independent Examiner, but that's back before I was doing these deep dives. So not much to report on last Friday's article. It was kind of a cop-out article because I was like, I'm in too deep. I've done an hour and a half of research. I need to write this up. Anyhoozle, I do want to note that it does contribute to, Virginia was probably the most important state in the Union at the turn of the 19th century. At that time, Virginia was obviously the most important state, had the most money, had the most people, very powerful. And there were some serious people against the United States Constitution. Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, Edmund Randolph, who was governor and along with George Mason, had walked out of the Constitutional Convention, refusing to sign the document. So there was a serious fight over the Constitution in Virginia, and the Independent Examiner was no small part of that. In fact, I want to even acknowledge that when Virginia ratified the Constitution, the vote was 89 to 79. That's a 10 vote swing. And that means if just 6 people in Virginia had decided to vote against the Constitution, it would not have been ratified in Virginia and probably would not have stood the test of any other states ratifying it, because Virginia was absolutely necessary for the Constitution to pass. And the Independent Examiner was a very important part of dragging the anti-federalist segment back to anti-federalism, if not dragging them over, keeping them anti-federalist, as opposed to letting people get convinced to change their vote, although many people did get convinced, including Edmund Randolph, who has a very interesting story on his own. So not a whole lot to report on this one today, but whammy, there you go. Hi, Misfit. Everyone's week is going very good, at least mine is. Thank you so much for coming. Now let's go to our first real founder of the week, because like I said, that one was kind of a cop-out. And we're going to talk about Timothy Pickering. Okay. Hit record here. Press my button. I got a new haircut. Do you like my haircut? I don't like it. I like it. I don't know. Anyway. I just don't like haircuts. I don't know why. It's weird. weird thing I have. Okay, let's see. I do. Our next founder is Timothy Pickering. Now, Timothy Pickering is one of those really integral members of the American Revolution who was there from literally the start to essentially the finish, who gets, of course, completely overlooked, except here at Founder of the Day, where we give him all the attention he deserves. Although it's going to be very brief this time. So anyway, Timothy Pickering was a very young man who had really just graduated Hartford and began working in his town's clerk office for the local county clerk's office. And he was appointed as a lieutenant in his local militia, which is an office, it's a lower level office, but for a young man, a very good start. Now, it was while he was serving in the militia in the years leading up to the American Revolutionary War that he actually writes a book, or we'll call it a pamphlet. It was called An Easy Plan for a Militia. And this easy plan for a militia, well, people seem to like it. And many of the militias around Boston that would soon get involved in some hostilities used it to train their militias. Now, this actually would end up becoming, first things first, the war breaks out at Lexington and Concord, and Timothy Pickering gets his militia to go join the fight as part of the Minutemen. Unfortunately, he gets there a little bit later than everyone else. And he also, and he doesn't really participate in Lexington and Concord, though I should note, just a few months before Lexington and Concord, Timothy Pickering oversees something called Leslie's Retreat, which was in Salem, Massachusetts, famous for its witch trials, but 100 years later, there was a standoff between British officers and Massachusetts militia led by Timothy Pickering. Now, this could have broken into a firefight and could have turned into really the Lexington and Concord with the shot heard around the world. Fortunately, there was a preacher that left his church and came out and convinced the British officers to retreat and say, hey, the locals are hot-headed, just leave them alone, and everything ended up going pretty smoothly. But Timothy Pickering was a part of that. And then, as I said, just 2 months later, Lexington and Concord breaks out. He goes to fight. And he doesn't go home for quite some time. Now, his easy plan for a militia that he wrote ends up, the Continental Army takes it in when it's created and is really the first training manual of the Continental Army. Now, this would later be replaced by Baron von Steuben's Blue Book, but that's a few years later. And again, Timothy Pickering is in his early 20s at this point. He's still making a name for himself. So he goes and he makes his name. He joins the Siege of Boston. He is almost immediately recognized by George Washington, who appoints him as an adjutant general. Now, adjutant general is a fancy term, and it is essentially a HR department for an army. It does the business of operating a war. And Timothy Pickering was one of the main people helping Washington run the business that was the Continental Army. Now, he does this for several years until eventually General Nathaniel Greene, he gets promoted to Nathaniel Greene was a major general. He ends up going to fight in the South. For a while, Nathaniel Greene is fighting the war in the South and simultaneously acting as Quartermaster General. Eventually, Greene leaves the position of Quartermaster General, and Timothy Pickering takes over. So, after serving as Adjutant General in the Continental Army, he takes over as Quartermaster General. He's in charge of making sure the troops have food and clothing and everything you need to, just be alive. Making him extremely important to the revolution. Again, very overlooked for his participation in the war itself. Now, after the war, he goes home for a little while, but then the Constitution gets ratified, and George Washington comes around and needs to assemble himself a cabinet. And he does this. And there are some people who are pretty famous who get into this cabinet, but there's one guy who becomes Postmaster General, Timothy Pickering. Now, Postmaster General is not the sexiest position you could have in a cabinet, but especially back then, Postmaster General was extremely important. He was in charge of communications for the young United States of America. He needed to make sure people could get information to and from, from New Hampshire to South Carolina, and heck, even out to the Midwest, or not quite the Midwest, over the mountains to the western half of this side of the Mississippi. So, extremely important. So important, in fact, that when Henry Knox resigns as Secretary of War, Timothy Pickering is promoted to Secretary of War of the United States. And then after that, when Tommy Jefferson leaves, Timothy Pickering is then promoted again to Secretary of State of the United States of America. Now, Secretary of State is so extraordinarily important at this point in time. I'll remind you, nowadays when we have a vice president, that is kind of the next person in line to become president. But back then, Secretary of State was next in line. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State and became president. His Secretary of State was James Madison, who became president. His Secretary of State was James Monroe, who became president. His Secretary of State was John Adams, who became president. And even in the corrupt bargain with Henry Clinton later on, just as the American Revolution is over, the bargain doesn't make Henry Clinton vice president. It makes Henry Clinton Secretary of State, because he would then be next in line for president. So I'm saying all this to drive home how important Timothy Pickering was to actually be promoted to the office of Secretary of State of the United States. Now, he is in this position when John Adams takes over. John Adams kind of famously takes over George Washington's cabinet and wants everything to be as smooth as possible. Like, this is a major transition of power that's never happened before. So taking over for George Washington, John Adams tries his best to be as George Washington-y as possible. He himself knows that he was not a George Washington, but he still attempted to do this by bringing in most of Washington's cabinet. And this included Secretary of State Timothy Pickering. And Timothy Pickering is essentially overseeing the quasi-war with France that doesn't really break out into a hot war. It's a cold war, but it's there. And he oversees it. Now, unfortunately, he ends up getting a little bit of tussle with Madison. He and James McHenry, who was at that point Secretary of War, they were doing whatever Alexander Hamilton said. Now, I have probably casually referred to them as lackeys or henchmen. That is not true. I say that to kind of talk about their position in the Federalist Party in the late 1790s. You know, Hamilton was running the party, even though John Adams was president, and these guys were Team Hamilton more than Team Adams, and they were being a little bit sneaky on the inside. Again, I don't want to take credit away from him, as you've just seen me talk about what a great service he did for his country. I don't want to take too much credit away from him, but he was acting on Hamilton's behalf in Adams's cabinet, and that caused some problems. Eventually, he kind of gets fired, kind of resigns. It's kind of it's a little bit debatable on exactly who pulled the trigger first, him or Adams, but he and James McHenry end up leaving. Now, he ends up goes back home, goes back to private life, but he continues to be an extremely outspoken Federalist throughout the Jefferson and Madison administrations. And in fact, he does go back to Washington for a bit. He acts in the United States House of Representatives and serves in the United States Senate. So he continues to work in the federal government, again, as one of the last Federalist holdouts. Unfortunately, after Jefferson becomes president and Hamilton dies in the duel with Burr, the Federalist Party slowly but surely fades away. And Timothy Pickering sticks around as a holdout for the Federalist Party. In fact, he even attends the Hartford Convention. Now, in brief, the Hartford Convention, which happened in the end of 1814, they came together to make some recommendations for the U.S. Constitution, some amendments to the Constitution. They didn't like how Virginians kept being president, things of that nature. Didn't like the War of 1812 at all. But either way, they meet, and people accuse the meeting of wanting to have New England cede from the Union. Now, there's no evidence of that. There were a few people who said things like that, but for the most part, the actual people who attended the Hartford Convention were just trying to resolve issues that they saw lingering from the Constitutional Convention, which at that point was only 10, 25 years earlier. They had friends who were there. So the people went to the Hartford Convention. As I said, it did not go well, and especially because they announced their decisions right as word of Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans comes through, and the end of the war, a victorious war against Britain, comes through, and you have these Federalists in New England saying, hey, the Constitution's not so great. So Timothy Pickering, because he's associated with the Hartford Convention, that essentially ends his career. He goes back to private life. And he really would have no place in the future emergence of the second party system of United States history. But as I said, he wrote the first manual for the United States that was used by the Continental Army. He was a quartermaster general. He was an adjutant general in the war. He was the first postmaster of the United States. He was Secretary of State and Secretary of War. He, U.S. Senator, Congressman. Timothy Pickering is an extremely important person. And in fact, before I end on Pickering, I'm going to go back for one little side note. There was a thing called the Newburgh Conspiracy right at the end of the war. Most of you probably know about it, but I got a quick wrap up. After the war was about to end, and they were sitting upstate New York waiting for the British to leave New York City so we could finally be victorious, some of the generals in the war and upper level officers were not happy with the Continental Congress. They weren't getting paid, and all these congressmen were lawyers and doctors and merchants who had jobs to go home to, and all these soldiers were soldiers who didn't have a war to fight anymore. And they actually considered They were considering what to do about what was going on in Philadelphia. Now, they may not have marched on Philadelphia to take it, but they were talking about just giving Washington command of the entire country. And Washington famously goes in. He goes in with a note from Congress. He can't see it. He takes off, puts on his glasses, says his famous line, "You'll permit me to put on my spectacles, for I've grown not only gray, but nearly blind in service of my country." All these big men generals, they all fall apart and start weeping, and they're embarrassed about how they've gone back on their ideals. Except Timothy Pickering. Timothy Pickering essentially looks around the room at everyone saying, "Sorry, George, we won't do anything." He looks around the room and says, "That's it? He's just got to put on some glasses and you all start weeping like little babies?" Now, I'm paraphrasing his words, of course, but I want to give props to Timothy Pickering. Say what you will about him, he was a man of principle, and he did not change his mind flippantly. Now, that is an extremely brief overview of the life of an extraordinarily important and overlooked American founder, Timothy Pickering. I see, Ashley, so you comment. Hey, everyone, what are some of the amendments they wanted to make to the Constitution? So they wanted, I don't recall all of them offhand. I really should. 20 years ago, I spent a lot of time reading about the Hartford Convention. It's a fascinating little piece of American history. I know that they wanted to limit so right now under the Constitution, the president and vice president cannot be from the same state. They wanted to make it so that you could not have two consecutive presidents from the same state. So if I'm from Virginia and I'm president, then the next term, some other state got a president. There were a few other things. They're eluding me a little bit right now. But a lot of things of that nature. I believe they wanted to make it a little harder to declare war because they were not happy that the War of 1812 broke out, even though I will say these are mostly the same people who just 15 years earlier wanted to declare war on France. It was a little bit of contradiction, although Timothy Pickering was one of the few really traditional, American revolutionaries who served in the Hartford Convention. By the time the Hartford Convention comes around, it's a lot of children of founders. Harrison Gray Otis of the Otis family, his uncles were important to the Revolution, and he had come up a little bit later. So it was mostly younger men. I believe Nathan Dane did attend, but he was kind of sent to make sure things didn't get out of hand. You know what? Ashley, next week I'll put out an episode. I'll do a video specifically about the Hartford Convention because it is a fascinating one. I'll refresh my memory and I'll go real deep on it. So that'll be fun. Excuse me. Doing a lot of talking. Thank you for the question. Thank you so much. Who's our next founder? Oh, MKG. Mary Katherine Goddard. Okay. Our next founder is Mary Katherine Goddard. Mary Katherine Goddard came from Rhode Island. Unfortunately, her father, who I believe was a physician, her father was a postmaster in Rhode Island, and he passed away at just 17 years old, and she actually took over for a bit her job as postmaster. Now, her brother was publishing a newspaper in Providence at the time. Her brother, William Goddard, would in his own right be an important publisher during the American Revolution. But eventually, Mary, her brother, and her mother all moved down to Philadelphia for a moment and then permanently to Baltimore, Maryland. And her brother, William, starts a paper, the Maryland Journal. But her brother, William, would just kept leaving. And essentially, Mary Katherine would take over running the Maryland Journal, and she would end up doing this for the rest of her life. And not only did her print house publish the Maryland Journal, but she published anything a print house would, several books, many pamphlets, even an almanac, making her one of the, there were a handful of the female publishers in colonial America. And she sides with the Americans when the American Revolution breaks out. As someone who was a printer, the Stamp Act in 1765 very much affected her business, and as with most publishers, she joined, as I said, the Patriots. Now, due to the training she had received from her father as a teenager, and her position that she had elevated herself to in Baltimore, she's actually appointed to the position of Baltimore Postmaster. So not a Postmaster General, just Baltimore, but still a very important position overseeing the delivery of letters. Not a position you would usually see a woman achieve at this point in time in history, but she does. She becomes Postmaster of Baltimore just as the Revolutionary War breaks out. In fact, it's the Revolutionary government that gives her this position. Now, at the end of 1776, the British take over Baltimore. I'm sorry, Philadelphia. When the British take over Philadelphia, well, the Continental Congress goes running away. Now, this is not the real takeover of Baltimore, of Philadelphia. That would be the following year, but they thought that Congress was going to be taking over. So Continental Congress goes to Baltimore very briefly for just a few months. But while they're there, they need someone to print something for them. They need someone to print the Declaration of Independence. You see, the Declaration of Independence had been printed by John Dunlap with the Dunlap broadsides in the days after the vote for independence had taken place, and then it was sent out all around to George Washington. It was sent to all the states. It was sent over to Europe, declaring, hey, we're an independent country now. You're going to have to deal with that. Also, they had a broadside created that was an engrossment created for them all to sign, and that took a little bit longer, and that's why they don't actually sign the Declaration of Independence till August 2nd of 1776. But when they go to Baltimore, there had only been a handful of copies printed, and none with the signers' names on it, because most of the copies that had been printed at that point was before anyone signed anything. So they go to the local printmaster in Baltimore to have more copies printed up for mass publication for the general public. And who's that local printer in Baltimore? Well, it's Miss Goddard over here. And Mary Katherine Goddard prints the Declaration of Independence. Not only does she print the Declaration of Independence, but she's the first person to print the Declaration of Independence and all the signers' names on the bottom. She is the one who revealed to the world those very people who signed their names to their death warrant. Now, I want to also note that this is the first time anyone in the world got a glimpse at the names that signed the Declaration of Independence. And on the bottom of that publication, what are called the Goddard broadsides, it says, printed by Mary Katherine Goddard. So it's not in the list of names, but right below all these men's names who signed the Declaration of Independence, the first time the world read these names, right below those names was the name Mary Katherine Goddard. Now, am I saying Mary Katherine signed the Declaration of Independence? No, her signature is not there. Am I saying anyone thought she did when she published this? No, everyone knew she was just the printer. But when we look for copies of the Declaration of Independence right now in the world, some of the most important copies are printed by and have the name Mary Katherine Goddard on the bottom. Now, I do want to wrap this up by saying she would print the Maryland Journal. She printed the newspaper through the end of the Revolution. Unfortunately, she gets in a little bit of an argument with her brother, who could be a little testy, as other founders would acknowledge. But she gets through the American Revolution. She has an argument with her brother, and she stops associating with the organization. Now, she does actually continue as Postmaster General for a total of 15 years. She is Postmaster Postmaster of Baltimore. Unfortunately, when the Constitution is signed and George Washington organizes his cabinet, and there is a new Postmaster General named Timothy Pickering, who decides to remove Mary Katherine Goddard from her position. Now, again, we've spoken very recently about Timothy Pickering, and some of the decisions he made were not necessarily everyone's favorite, but he thought he wanted to essentially, I don't believe he removed her because she was a woman. I think he removed her because the federal government was trying to make a name for itself as the federal government, and he wanted his own people in every position. And so, therefore, unfortunately, she leaves. Now, Mary Katherine, now she doesn't have a printing press. Her brother took it away from her because they got in an argument. It was technically his. And she's no longer postmaster. She ends up opening a bookstore, and she sells books and stationery for the rest of her days, and has a dry goods shop also. And I will note, when she was removed as Postmaster of Baltimore, many local business people signed a petition that they sent to Timothy Pickering saying, no, Mary Katherine's doing a great job. There is no reason to remove her. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of her neighbors and friendly businessmen, she does not continue in that position. As I said, she opens up a shop and spends the rest of her life running a little bookshop and stationery store, and I do believe she runs another little printing press for a while, but it's not as successful as the original. So that is an extraordinarily brief overview of the life of Mary Katherine Goddard. A really fascinating person. Just a great all-around character. Who is next? Isaac Smith. I always want to make up silly versions of the names, but I don't want to say, like, the wrong name. I'm going to take a quick sip of my water because of all my talking. Excuse me, got my cool new blue water bottle. It really flashes against the background. It does not match what I'm going for at all. You probably should go back to the cup, but oh well, what are you going to do? Make sure you subscribe for trivia tomorrow. I'll be drinking coffee, my Friday night coffee. All right. Pull up Isaac Smith. Our next founder is Isaac Smith. Now, there is no known image of Isaac Smith. This is an image of the Trenton Banking Company, and we'll get there. So, Isaac Smith was a Princeton University graduate who was a physician, and he actually takes over for Nathaniel Scudder, who would later sign the Articles of Confederation, as the president of the Medical Society of New Jersey. So, as a very young man, he is overseeing the promotion of improvements to the practice of medicine and benefits of the health of the citizens of New Jersey. This is colonial New Jersey, but as revolution approaches, he continues to support the patriot cause. In fact, this physician is appointed as a colonel when he signs up for the New Jersey militia. You would expect a physician to be a surgeon. Most of them were. But he ends up becoming a colonel. Now, he is already on the Committee of Correspondence for his section of New Jersey at this point, and he doesn't see much action. He acts more as a policeman, going around helping root out loyalists in New Jersey, which was a very important job, especially as you get into like the late 1770s, when there's a lot of forage warring going on for food and stuff in New Jersey. New Jersey's, I believe, had the most battlegrounds, and most battles of the Revolution actually took place in New Jersey. A lot of people realize that. Either way, he ends up resigning this position because in 1777 he is selected to be on the New Jersey Supreme Court, and he would stay on the New Jersey Supreme Court for the next 30 years. That is 3 decades of the founding. You know, this is the year after independence, all the way through basically till James Madison becomes president. He's sitting on the New Jersey Supreme Court. Not the highest court in the whole wide world, but when he gets the position before the Constitution, it was the highest court to anyone living in New Jersey. Now, he stays in his home state. He doesn't really get into the national spotlight, but in 1795, he's actually elected to the United States House of Representatives. Now, New Jersey at this point, much like New York and several other mid-Atlantic states, could be considered a swing state. It bounced side to side depending on the year and the election. And this meant partisan tensions were pretty high. But Isaac Smith seems to have towed both party lines right in the middle, because he did have, even though he was a Federalist, he was considered by everyone that I read quotes about him on as a very level-headed person. Now, this doctor turned colonel turned Supreme Court justice turned congressman returns to New Jersey, where he is unanimously elected as the first president of the Trenton Banking Company. And that's this image over here, the Trenton Banking Company. There were a lot of banks that were created about this time, especially after the Constitution was created and Hamilton made all these plans that were very good for banking. Banks started popping up, and the Trenton Banking Company was no different. Now, it was a bit controversial. There was actually a letter published in the local newspaper that questioned if Isaac Smith was the right man for the job, because he was basically being given handouts from, quote, Philadelphia stockholders, aka the wealthy elite, are just giving this guy money to start a bank. There's something going on here. Now, nothing ever comes of it. It's just, I thought it was very interesting when I stumbled onto that little trash talk of him in the public papers. Now, he serves, as I said, he serves for several years as president of the Trenton Banking Company, and then spends the remainder of his life, this whole time, on the New Jersey Supreme Court. And he spends the remainder of his life there. That essentially becomes his career. There is one thing I want to note about him that I found fascinating. There was a negotiation with Native Americans in upstate New York called the Treaty of Big Tree that happened not too far from Rochester, New York now, a little bit south of there, President Washington had sent a bunch of people to go negotiate, and they did. And one of the people that was nominated by George Washington, approved and confirmed by the United States Senate to negotiate, was essentially a diplomatic mission to a foreign nation, because that is how the Native Americans were treated. There was the Treaty of Big Tree was negotiated, and Isaac Smith was chosen by Washington and confirmed by the Senate, but he politely turned down the offer. And sadly, his reasoning when he said to George Washington the reason he didn't want to travel just to upstate New York from New Jersey is that his third son had just passed away. And that was his third and final son. And he was very distraught from this. And while he still maintained, at that point, he was still in Congress. He still served in Congress and still served on the Supreme Court in New Jersey. He just didn't have it in him to travel to upstate New York and negotiate with the Native Americans. Although the Treaty of Big Tree is extremely important, because about a third of what would later become the Erie Canal sits in land that was negotiated away from the Native Americans, I guess the polite way to say it, during the Treaty of Big Tree. So his reasoning and his being left out of that, I thought, was one of the more fascinating things about Isaac Smith, who is unfortunately, a very lower level guy. I'm actually surprised how much I was able to dig up on Isaac Smith, because he is very, I guess he's on the New Jersey Supreme Court, so he's not that far down the totem pole, but his name is fairly obscure, and we love fairly obscure founders here. I hope you learned a little bit about Isaac Smith. Let's pop over to our next founder, founder number 5, James Baird. All right. Excuse me, I'm taking another sip of water. If you guys like Alexander Hamilton's story, you are going to like this story. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Oh, excuse me. Okay, let's do it. Our next founder is James A. Baird. James A. Baird was a Princeton graduate who had actually studied law under Joseph Reed, a very important American founder in his own right. Bayard went back home to Delaware he kind of misses the Revolutionary War because he's a little bit younger, but at just 29 years old, he's elected to the United States House of Representatives. He becomes a very important Federalist, and he would actually serve several presidents in the first 2 decades of America under the Constitution. He is there for many important precedents. Now, the big story in James A. Baird's life comes during the election of 1800. Now, if you've seen the play Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, you'll know that Alexander Hamilton was given a very important choice. Who should he support? His old buddy Aaron Burr or his nemesis Thomas Jefferson? And Hamilton famously supports Jefferson, saying essentially, even though I disagree with Jefferson's ideals, at least Jefferson has principles and will stand on them, as opposed to Burr, who in Hamilton's eyes could be flippant and change his opinions based on who was the room just to get ahead in life. Now, if you've seen the play Hamilton, it's indicated that Hamilton shouts the name Jefferson from the rooftops. In fact, I think he is actually standing on a roof in the play, shouting it to the world. This is not how things worked at the time, because Hamilton had already resigned several years before from the Treasury Department, and he was in New York City over here, and the United States Congress was in Washington, D.C. Oh, Philadelphia? No, I don't know if they went for Philadelphia at this point. Oh, by late 1800, yes, because John Adams moved to Washington, D.C. Rewind. Hamilton's in New York City, and Congress is in Washington, D.C., so even if Hamilton did shout it from the rooftops, they weren't going to hear it. So what did Hamilton do? He wrote it in a letter, as they did at the time. They gave it to the post office, who traveled the letter by horseback down to Washington, D.C. But who did he send the letter to? Not to Congress. No. He sent it to his friend, his mouthpiece, James A. Baird. And it's James A. Baird who goes in and speaks on Hamilton's behalf, not necessarily at Congress, but to other Federalists in Washington, D.C., saying, like, look at this letter I got from Hamilton. This is what he's saying. They asked Bayard to write to Hamilton. Hamilton writes back to him and says Jefferson. Now, there's one really, really interesting line in this correspondence. As I said, Hamilton, Hamilton didn't just go shouting from the rooftops, but he was nervous about Burr's ambitions. And the line in the letter to Bayard is referencing, if Burr were to be elected, quote, "Let us not be responsible for the evils which in all probability will follow." End quote. Literally saying, if Burr's elected, then there are going to be evils. And I don't want to be blamed for him. It's very intense, really demonstrating his opinion of Aaron Burr. And again, there would still be 4 years worth of arguments before there's actually a duel. And I'm not aware of Burr actually ever reading that letter. I doubt he did. So James A. Bayard, for his part, he does later go on to participate in the United States Senate. He fills up vacancy, so he's only there for about 2 or 3 years, not a full term. And he spends no, I'm sorry. He's only there for a few years and then gets reelected to a full term. Let me say that again. And he ends up spending about a decade in the United States Senate. He is against declaring war in the War of 1812, but when hostilities break out, he takes kind of a turn of phrase and really supports President Madison and becomes a real supporter of James Madison, showing his loyalty to his country. He disagreed with the war. He was a Federalist who disagreed with Madison as a Democratic Republican, but once the war was declared, he threw his lot in with the President of the United States. Because of his support, you would think he'd be looked down on by other Federalists, but he was not. He's actually goes on to be one of the 5 peace commissioners sent to the Netherlands to sign the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the War of 1812. He is there with, there are 5 other people. I don't remember all of them, but I know Henry Clay is a young man making his name there. And John Quincy Adams is a middle-aged man by this point who's already made a name for himself and would later go on to be Secretary of State and then the United President of the States. President of the United States is probably how I should say that. And then he's actually is then appointed to replace John Quincy Adams as the minister to Russia, though he turns it down. And this is where his story gets a little bit sad. He turns it down. He doesn't want to go to Russia. He wants to return to America. And he gets on a boat and journeys home. And he gets off the boat. And just 5 days after he makes it back to the United States, he falls ill and he passes away. And that is the life of James A. Bayard, a man who worked as Hamilton's mouthpiece during one of the most interesting elections in American history, and then went over to help end the War of 1812, a war he didn't think should be fought in the first place. I hope you learned something about James A. Bayard. Like and subscribe. Dang, it's intense. Yes. Yeah, Hamilton really had a negative opinion of Burr. Although, as I said, as we discussed when Karen Q came on 2 weeks ago or so, we were talking about Aaron Burr and how you can't just get to those levels if people don't like you. Like, Hamilton was being a little dramatic when he said these things. Probably wasn't totally wrong, but he certainly wasn't totally right. Excuse me, pounding that water bottle. I like having a water bottle now. I've been trying it out a few weeks. Anyway, what was the new founder? Penelope Barker. Penelope Barker is someone I had no idea existed just a handful of days ago. So let's get into it. Our next founder is Penelope Barker. Just a handful of days ago, I had never even heard of this name, and I spent quite some time learning about this name. Penelope Barker was, by 1774, on her 3rd marriage. She had married young. Her first 2 husbands passed away. And then she marries another widower named Thomas, who actually goes to represent North Carolina in London to the crown. He's an agent for North Carolina, and he leaves. And because of his business there, and because of the hostilities that ended up breaking out between the United States, the soon-to-be United States and Great Britain, she doesn't see her husband for over a decade. Her 3rd husband. Now, that doesn't mean she's not a patriot. It doesn't mean she doesn't have stuff to do. She gets radicalized pretty easily. She's overseeing her husband's businesses in North Carolina, and many of the intolerable acts affect her businesses she's running very directly. Now, she becomes inspired by the Boston Tea Party and wants to have a little tea party of her own, and she does. Now, at about the same time the First Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, in late October of 1774, just when the First Continental Congress is publishing its Continental Association and the Declaration of Rights and Resolves to send around to the king and all the colonies saying, we got to stand up for ourselves. Let's organize a boycott. At exactly that time, Penelope Barker meets at her friend's house, and she gets 50 other women to come meet at the house with them. And this house is in Edenton, North Carolina. And Barker writes a petition, and she shows it to the other women, and all 51 women involved sign it. This event is called the Edenton Tea Party. Now, it's not a tea party like in Boston where they're throwing stuff over the sides. It's more like a tea party, except they're not drinking tea, because the petition they write is an agreement to boycott any British goods, including tea, which is literally exactly what the Continental Congress is doing in Philadelphia at exactly this same time. They also make a commitment, as many women around the country would do, to produce as much as they can in the home. And just a side note here, while mostly men fought in the war itself, women were integral to the revolutionary cause because they were not only boycotting British goods, but once the war started, Britain was blockading the coast. There was nothing coming in. There were, of course, people smuggling things in, but most of what was getting smuggled in was gunpowder and other things that you would need to win the war. So women in the households took on the responsibility of making clothes and making literally everything. And this is what Penelope Barker, as one of the wealthier women of North Carolina, and her wealthy friends at this tea party were saying is, we're, even us, the wealthy women who are used to being served on, and they were, and she did own slaves on her plantations, as many of these women did. And obviously the responsibility to most of this creating the work would fall to the slaves, but they would, at least for symbolism purposes, take on the responsibility of many things themselves too. And as I was saying before, for most women didn't have slaves. Most women were part of most families, which were not very wealthy or middling, and had to do things on their own. Now, Penelope Barker goes on to, she not only did they sign this Edenton Tea Party agreement, they sent it to England. And Penelope Barker includes a note, and in her note to England, she says, actually criticizes the Sons of Liberty in Boston to a degree, saying that as opposed to the Sons of Liberty in Boston, who dressed up as Native Americans to throw tea in the harbor, we women are signing our names to this document. Again, this is a year and a half before the Declaration of Independence, and they don't know what's coming out of the First Continental Congress at this point. They just know that they were being brave enough to sign their own names and send it to England. Now, there's a harsh rash of criticism in the London papers when this happens. They are just talking about, look at these women in the colonies, these backwoods women. They don't know their place. Their words, not mine. They're trying to do men's jobs, and they're even doing it wrong because the men shouldn't be doing this. All these kind of things. And there's even an interesting engraving published in the papers that essentially implies that these are floozies. I don't know the right word to say without being getting canceled by YouTube, but they are saying they're loose women who don't pay attention to their children, and there's even an image of a dog peeing on a child that they printed in the public papers because that's how terrible the people of Britain, not all of them, but the wealthy elites primarily, thought Penelope Barker and her series of friends were. So that is a very brief overview of the life of Penelope Barker and the Edenton Tea Party, the time the women got together to send a little petition of their own to London. Hope you like it. I think it's fascinating. I forgot to, if you click in the link in the description to the article for Penelope, it will bring you, I put it in the article, the picture I was just talking about. I forgot to put it up here for you because I'm terrible at running a YouTube channel. If you haven't figured that out by now, I'm good at learning about the American Revolution. I can talk about it pretty well, but running a YouTube channel is not my jam. As much as I would like for it to be. Okay, last but not least, Robert Goldsboro. All right, For those of you who do trivia on Fridays, then the name Goldsboro comes up, this is the name we're talking about. Right. Right. Our next founder is Robert Goldsboro. Now, I have written about Robert Goldsboro in the past. This time I'm focusing specifically on a letter he wrote to George Washington. But to recap, Robert Goldsboro was educated in the Americas and in England and practiced law in London as well as the colonies. He was from Maryland, where he became one of the most successful lawyers and so important to the local colonial government that when the first Continental Congress was called, he was elected to go. Now, he doesn't go. I could never figure out why he doesn't go, but he doesn't go to the First Continental Congress, and therefore does not sign the Continental Association. Miss signing number 1. He then is elected to go to the Second Continental Congress, and he does go to the Second Continental Congress for a little while. And then, just before independence is voted on, probably because he sees independence coming, as several founders did. They saw independence coming and wanted to go back to their home state where they thought the real important work was. He leaves about 2 months before the Declaration of Independence is voted on and 3 months before it's signed. Missed signing number 2. He goes back to private life for a while and then eventually, in 1787, is elected by Maryland to go to the Constitutional Convention. Sadly, he has a bit of ill health and he doesn't go. Missed signing number 3. Robert Goldsboro should have signed 3 of the 4 major documents of the American Revolution, and sadly for him, signed none, pretty much just by chance. That's okay, we'll forgive him. Now, he was, like I said, real sick. In fact, after the Constitution was written, Goldsboro would be elected to the Maryland Ratification Convention, and he would skip that also and die just a few weeks later, because he was very, very sick. That being said, Goldsboro knew the weight of the Constitutional Convention, and he sent a letter to George Washington. In fact, he addresses the letter to His Excellency George Washington, President of the Convention in Philadelphia. Now, at this point, Goldsboro had never actually met Washington, so he doesn't actually send it under his name. He sends it his pseudonym he uses is the author, and he actually sends with this addressed to Washington, he sends a letter that essentially says, my name, you don't know me, and that's why I'm sending this anonymously, but more or less says, I'm supposed to be there with you, but since I can't be, here is what I'm thinking. And, it's a very polite letter as it was at the time, but he essentially writes out his idea of what the government should be. Now, although he doesn't sign any documents, he was a former Continental Congressman and one of the most respected legal minds in Maryland. So it's really interesting to take a look at the government he outlines in just a few paragraphs. Essentially, his plan of government, and I did it really brief in my article, I'm going to do it really brief now, but he promotes the idea of a federal government. But much like we discussed when we were talking about Brutus the last handful of weeks, he wanted to make sure the limits on each branch were very specifically defined. As for the Continental Congress, he wants to keep that essentially the same. The way it's elected, the way it operates, that should be continued more or less the same, giving really the power to the states to choose delegates to the Congress, the federal Congress, as they liked, which again would really put the hands in the power of the hands in the states. But he did want to treat it like a real government, because the Continental Congress really only had a legislative branch. There was no judicial branch, and there was no executive branch, and everyone living at that time agreed that a real government would have all 3 branches. So although Continental Congress and the legislative branch remain pretty much the same, Goldsboro talks about creating an executive. Now, again, everyone knew they were meeting to change the Articles of Confederation, and some people wanted more changes, some people wanted less, and the Continental Congress met in secret. They were just known as the Philadelphia Convention at the time. They didn't know the Constitutional Convention. They were just called the Philadelphia Convention because they didn't know they were writing a whole new constitution at that point. But the eyes of the world were on what was happening there. If not the world, at least the United States were on what was happening in Philadelphia, because who knows what was coming out? Who knows what kind of improvements these chosen leaders could create? Goldsboro writes that he wants there to be what he called a governor. Now, another side note here. We have a president of the United States of America, but that could have easily been a governor, because each state at the time, most states had governors, like now. Some states, like Delaware and Pennsylvania, had presidents. Those words were essentially interchangeable. So when he's talking about the president of the United States, Goldsboro actually uses the word governor, which it's just really interesting to reflect that they, if Governor Morris wrote the word governor instead of president, we'd have governor of the United, Governor Joe Biden right now, and it would seem natural to us and not strange at all. I just thought that was a funny side note. Either way, he's running governor, but he's talking about president, and he says that there should be one person elected for 1 year term by the Continental Congress, and there should be a cabinet of 13 members who are chosen, I believe, by the states. He does a few of the things he says a little bit contradict themselves, but again, he's not writing a constitution by himself. He's just laying out ideas for George Washington. But it seems like he wants the separate states, each state, to choose its own cabinet member to work in the executive branch, and a quorum, 2/3 vote of the cabinet members, coupled with the president's decision, would make any executive decisions. He did think there should be the ability to raise an army, though he doesn't necessarily say there should be a standing army, but he does say you need to be able to enforce the laws created by the Continental Congress or the legislature, same thing. You need an executive to enforce those things. And so you really need that. And he thought that doing it with an elected cabinet of 13, one from each state, and the president with a 1 year term chosen by the Congress, not from Continental Congress, that is a change. The Continental Congress would choose its own president, because president at the time was associated as like a chairman, and a governor was more of someone who led a state. In fact, that is one of the reasons that they go with the word president instead of governor, is governor seemed too powerful, and president, you're working for us, essentially, with the idea of that, the propaganda behind choosing the word president. Goldsboro doesn't really dive too deep into that. He does, however, move on to the judicial branch. And he does think there should be a judicial branch. It is not so much like today's Supreme Court. It has a lot of the same ideas, chosen for life, things of that nature. But there are limitations to it. They really only decide on arguments between states, and then between states or the United States and foreign nations and the Native Americans. That is really all he thought the judicial system should do. I want to reference back to Brutus. One of the major complaints of the essays of Brutus and many anti-federalists, once the Constitution is written, is things are too loosely defined. The necessary and proper clause, like, what do you mean necessary and proper? Anything's necessary and proper. I could say, I need you to light your hair on fire. It's necessary and proper for me to eat this bag of Cheetos. Now, that doesn't make any sense, but you could say it, right? And that is one of the major arguments of many anti-federalists after the Constitution is published. They want things to be very specifically what can this government do, and what can it not do. We should define this very specifically. And Goldsboro actually sits on that a lot. And it's a really interesting perspective. A person who's writing in June of 1787 as the Constitutional Convention is going underway, someone who wants a stronger federal government, saying we need to add a president, we need to add a judicial system, we need to make it like a real government. Also, at the same time, taking what would just 6 months later be an anti-federalist position of it needs to be very specifically defined. Nothing can be done flippantly. Nothing can just be out there in the ether. As I said, as for Goldsboro, I found this very interesting. I just found this as a very interesting letter, and its reflection on the ideas passing through not just Maryland, but all of the different states by all the different people at the time of the writing of the United States Constitution. As I said, unfortunately for Goldsboro, he would pass away from the same disease that kept him from the Constitutional Convention just a year later, and making it so he couldn't even attend the ratification convention. But that's a brief overview of the author, Robert Goldsboro, who wrote anonymously to George Washington about what he thought a federal government should look like. And that's that. So that is all the stuff today. Hi, John Adams. Hi, and TJ. I'm sorry I didn't say hi to you before, but thank you so much thank you guys for coming. John Adams, popping in a little late. Sorry about that. I just ran through 7 founders of the week. I do cut these up. I actually, if you see me hitting the button when I go, I actually record the snippets as we go, and then I publish them every morning throughout the week. Some people don't have the time like you guys have to come hang out for an hour and listen to me talk the whole time. So they will just see snippets of the founders throughout the week, which you might also see too when they come out in the morning. It's nice to have a refresher. Sometimes I watch them too. I watch them to see what what a terrible job I did. Whatever. Thank you, TJ. John Adams. I've been attending getting evicted from my house. I only have too much fun home. Oof, tough, dude. Well, break a leg with that. I'm sure you will do it. You can do anything you put your mind to. So I'm told. I thought you were younger, so I'm, hopefully that's not completely on your shoulders. But you'll get through it. Keep on learning new stuff. Excuse me. It is tough for a lot of people out there, and I feel very bad for very many people right now. Hopefully we can find our way through as a nation. We'll see. Fair enough. Anyway, thank you guys for coming and hanging out. Let me know if there's any founders you'd like to learn about. Let me know if there's anything else I can do to make you guys happy. And definitely hit like and subscribe. I have a feeling the handful of you watching right now probably already are subscribed. You definitely like what's going on. And tomorrow's trivia. It should be a truckload of fun. So, great. Yeah, we'll be here tomorrow. Yeah, let's get as many people as we can. We got to do it. What did we get? Did we miss like 4 last week out of the 243 founders? We got 4. I think it was 3 weeks ago. We missed 2 guys. So get your think caps on. Remember Robert Goldsboro? He comes up every week, and every time I type it, I'm like, I got to talk about that guy again, because I wrote about him like literally 3 years ago. So every time I'm like, I got to write about that guy again, and I look into him. Found an article. Thought it was really fun. So hope you guys enjoyed it. We end with, what day is it? Thursday. No, it's round bottom. It is round bottom day. All right, guys. Well, thank you. Yeah, good luck, John Adams. You'll be all right. You'll make it. You got a good head on your shoulders. That's what you need. We are going to take off now. Again, thank you guys for hanging out. And round bottom.